Oh god.
Hello everyone, welcome to another video. We're just gonna jump right into it because this video is extremely long. I'm gonna be going over my entire art process from basically start to finish. I skipped showing the sketching portion because it would have taken way too long, but maybe there's gonna be a sketching video. We'll see. I hate sketching. So basically my process in a nutshell is just rough sketch, clean sketch, flats, rendering, lighting and effects, background, and then like adjustments, maybe. Okay, so starting with flats, I set the sketch layer to multiply blending mode with like less than 50% opacity. Then I make a new layer, and that's going to be the skin layer. I named it the skin layer. So I outlined the skin using my brush of choice, making it a closed area, okay? And then I have two ways of filling in the area. First way is to select outside the closed area and then invert the selection. Sometimes I use the lasso tool and trace inside the outline. I prefer the second option, which is using the lasso tool to trace inside the outline. I don't know why I did the first option. Then I color in the blank spots because the brush I use has a texture. Brushes with no texture or full opacity doesn't have this issue. I also use the color drop tool as well, but color drop only gets you so far. So this is what my layers look like so far. I'm used to doing one layer for each separate thing. Some people like to do absolutely all their flats on one layer. I don't know how they can do that because my brain hurts when I try and do that. So I do this instead, but you do whatever you feel comfortable with. Next, I use an airbrush with minimal texture for the eyes. I really like the look of blurry eyes. It's a nice contrast from the smooth rendering. Next, I draw the eyes, I duplicate the layer, and then I Gaussian blur it by like 3%. And I do it for the original eye layer as well, and then merge them together for the most ultimate blurry eyes. And then I clean up the eyes. I also fixed that one eye with the liquify tool because I didn't like how that one eye looked. After that, I do a new layer, and then I clip it onto the hair layer. And then I do a gradient using the airbrush tool again. And I use the Gaussian blur tool to smooth out the gradient. And then I merge the layers together. And then I just do the same for the other hair layer. Okay, moving on to skin rendering. I'm going to be talking about some technical art stuff for a second. So first, I color picked a shading color, which is more saturated, but has a darker value than the skin color. Next, I picked a color less saturated and has a darker value than the shading color. This is the second shading color. Then I color picked a highlighting color. The value is how dark or light a color is on the value scale. So see when I put the colors in grayscale how they're all different values? Yeah. One critique that I have is that the shading colors need to have higher contrast from the base color since they're too close in values. AKA, the shading colors need to be darker on the value scale. Using the first shading color with brush opacity around like 50% or less as the first pass. Next, I put the layer on alpha lock so the skin color doesn't go past like the flats. And then I use the second shading color to add more shadows / establish things like the jawline, the nose, the 𝐟𝐥𝐚𝐭𝐬, the eyelids, etc., etc. You know, do a rough pass first and then go in and blend everything together. Some people like to color pick to blend, but I personally prefer to use the smudge tool because I'm lazy, but I don't know, we're gonna try experimenting more in the future. Use the sketch as a guide, but remember to turn it off to make sure everything looks okay so far. I ended up using another shading color to deepen the values of everything because I felt like there was not enough contrast. Also, please remember to zoom out so you don't pay too much attention to something that nobody really cares about. And also remember to flip your canvas. I always forget to do that. Also, use the liquify tool to fix things if they aren't really looking right. Oh my god. Okay, I followed this lip rendering tutorial on Pinterest and I like religiously follow it now. It's like the only way I render lips. So I make a new layer, I clip it to the skin flat, and the blending mode is on multiply. And then I use the airbrush brush for blush and I lower the opacity. I use Gaussian blur for extra blurriness. And personally, I like to blush the fingertips, the tips of the ears, the nose, and near the eyes. Then I also did some adjustments to saturate the lips using the blush layer as well. Next, I just shaded the hand like I shaded the face. Keep in mind where the light source is. Personally, my comfort light source is the top right, so the shading is mostly towards the bottom left. Also, when drawing nails, please remember that the longer the nails, the higher the apex is, so the nails don't break. The apex is what makes your nail stronger and keeps it from like breaking and shit. So after that, I make a new layer on top of the blush layer. It's clipped to the skin layer and on multiply blend mode. I draw freckles using this brush pack. It's free. Using a lighter brown for like the smaller freckles and then progressively darker browns for bigger freckles. And I like to focus the freckles on like the cheekbones, the nose, and the forehead on the face, but freckles are also everywhere, so keep that in mind. And then I adjusted the layer's opacity. And then I did the same thing using a new layer on the add blending mode for like a more glittery effect. It's like super pretty. And then I merged the blush and freckles layer to the skin layer. And then technical art stuff part dos. What I'm doing here is mimicking this thing called subsurface scattering because it looks cool and also makes the skin look more dynamic. Basically, it's taking the shadows and making the edge of the shadows a more saturated color. In this case, it's for the skin, so it'll be more of like a coral color because people have blood inside of them. And then the deeper the shadow, it'll be a cooler, more desaturated color, so like purple because it looks nice. I'm messing around with the layer modes until I get the effect that I want for the more saturated color. And then this is where I noticed that there needed to be more contrast in the skin, so I started to adjust everything, but in the end, it didn't really help. So I kind of fixed it outside of the recording. And then I make a new layer, clip it to the skin on add blending mode to boost the highlights. And then I adjusted the opacity layer, duplicate, blur both, merge, and then merge everything down. That's gonna happen a lot. And then I recorded the face piercings, but unfortunately that recording footage crashed. So that sucks. Okay, I'm gonna get up and like get my Red Bull so I don't sound like a smoker who smokes like 50 cigarettes a day or something like that. I don't know. Okay. Okay. Hopefully, oh my god. I should have drank the Red Bull earlier. My voice sounds way better. Okay, anyways, moving on to rendering the ear piercings. So I drew the piercings, but both the recording and Procreate crashed, so I had to redraw them. Basically, it's just new layer on add blending mode, clipped onto the layer, and then use it as like the shiny, and then I merged everything down. And then a new layer on top using multiply blending mode, and then I added shading to the jewelry, but also shaded the skin as well. Piercings are really easy to render. I don't know what to tell you guys. And then next up is nail rendering. You know, it's just alpha locking the layer, basic shadows, and then new layer on top, add blending mode, and then highlighting, and then merging everything down, you know. Okay, so for the eye/eyelashes rendering, I make a new multiply layer clipped onto the eyes, and then I use the airbrush to outline the outside of the eye, and then shade the top as well, but I leave a space at the top because it looks more dimensional than just like having it all shaded in. I blur using Gaussian blur and adjust the layer opacity. And then I make a new add layer and then add pupils using like a cream color instead of a white for a little more color dimension. Duplicate, blur, merge down for one layer, you know. And then I make a new add layer under the multiply layer. And then airbrush using an orange and then adjust the opacity. So the brown eyes look more like brown, but not like dead brown. You know what I mean? Like full of life brown and not like boba brown or something. I don't know. Another add layer, but then I make lines and dots using complementary colors for extra sparkle. This is inspired by like 𝗀്ში no Ko. Duplicate, blur, merge to one layer. You know, I'm gonna say that so many times. And then I make a new add layer under the multiply layer. And then I use a star stamp to make stars. And then I duplicate that. I blur it, merge, adjust layer opacity. I also erase like a little bit of the stars towards like the top of the eyes because that area is supposed to be more shaded, so you don't really see the stars that much. Oh my god, my hand is getting tired of holding my phone. Okay, so for the eyelashes, I duplicate the eyelash layer and then blur it and then merge it down. And then I alpha lock the layer and then fill it in with like a lighter color, but leave a gap of like darker color as like the outline kind of. And then an add layer clipped onto the eyelash layer, highlighting the actual eyelashes, and then blend, and then add layer on top of eyelash layer, not clipped. The other one was clipped. This one is not clipped. And then I use the same star stamp I used for the eyes as eyelash highlight. You know, duplicate, blur, merge, adjust layer opacity. And then I also went back and like added more sparkles because I felt like it needed more sparkles. Clothes rendering. Okay, so for the blouse, put a multiply layer, clip to the blouse, and then, you know, add shadows. And then I added a texture layer for texture. And then I clipped it to the blouse. The texture layer should be like black and white or like grayscale. So you can use blending modes to like make it look good, you know? Personally, I use the soft light blending mode, and then I adjust the layer opacity, and then I merged everything down. And then for the cardigan, I alpha locked it, and then I color picked shading and highlight colors, and then using a new layer clipped to the cardigan layer. I used an airbrush using the shading color where the deeper shadows are supposed to be. And then I adjusted the layer opacity. And then I go back to the cardigan layer and shade using the shadow color with low brush opacity, and then blend using the smudge tool. I really enjoyed how I shaded the folds. I might experiment with shading like that next time. And then I used the highlight color on low brush opacity, and then I slowly added highlights. I also erased part of the airbrush layer, and then the part that I didn't erase is supposed to be like more in the back. That's why it's like a deeper shadow, you know? And then I merged everything down. Okay, moving on to the hair rendering. I duplicated the hair layer, and then I turned the hair layer to grayscale so I can render it easier, so it's like easier on my eyes, but also it's just like a technique that really good artists use so you can see like the values better. And then I kept the original color layer for the colors, obviously. So I color picked like the shading colors, and I ended up not even using like the deepest shade, which is like super cool. I drew like stray strands or like flyaway hairs for like extra emphasis that like the hair is being blown in the wind. So I used the shading color on extremely low brush opacity to add like softer shadows. It's okay if it's a little messy. And then I used a higher brush opacity for like the harder shadows. So like where like the edges are kind of. And then I blended the soft shadows. And I you know, make sure to follow the sketch to differentiate between like different hair chunks, because everything can like look the same if you don't have a sketch layer to like reference off of. But remember to turn off the sketch layer to make sure that everything looks good. Hair shading is like a little bit hard for me, and I'm still experimenting with how I do it. And then I realized I forgot to render the eyebrows, but you can't even tell I forgot, so it's fine. I'm gonna be adding a link to Feng Zhao's tutorials, because that's basically what I follow for like skin shading and hair shading, and like not really eye shading, but just a little bit and stuff like that. Like, I follow their tutorials religiously. It's definitely a helpful resource to like have on hand. And then I used the lighter shade to highlight, you know, blend as normal. I had to duplicate the colored layer multiple times to be able to fill in the extra flyaway hairs, since it wasn't there in the original color layer. And then I clipped that layer onto the grayscale hair layer, and then I messed around with the layer modes until it looked good, but I also made like adjustments as well. So I don't normally do this, but I airbrushed the skin color and clipped it to the layer for extra dreaminess, and also messed around with like layer modes and layer opacity until I liked what it looked like. And then I used a layer mask to erase part of the bangs partially to reveal the eyes, since I didn't like how the hair was like fully covering it. Another critique, I wish there was, again, more contrast. Same issue with the skin. I wish there was more contrast. Like, it looks good, but I wish the shadows were like deeper and more prominent. And then I clipped an ad layer and emphasized the highlights since it didn't look like shiny enough for me. I used an old custom brush I made to blend the highlights, since blending using the Amogus brush wasn't giving the effect that I wanted. And then I just repeat what I did for the back hair. Okay, so moving on to like adjustments and like lighting and stuff like that, we're like on the final stretch, guys. So I made a new layer on top of the cardigan, not clipped to it, to draw stars. The cardigan is actually inspired by a cardigan I made in real life. And then I did the lasso trick that I should have done before. And then I inserted another texture thing, you know, layer mode to soft light, adjust layer opacity. And then I made a new layer on multiply, and I clipped it. And then I made another multiply layer, but I shaded using gray and then merged it down. And then I selected all the layers and put them in a folder, and then named the folder. And then I duplicated that folder, and then I merged absolutely everything together. So it's just like one flat layer. And then I turned off the folder. So then I duplicated that one layer and then Gaussian blurred it for a dreamy blurry effect. And then I messed around with layer modes until it looked good. And then I adjusted the layer opacity. And then I'm pretty sure I clipped it to the original layer, and then I merged it down. So for the background, I added a bunch of sky photos that I've taken before. And then I messed around and like saw which ones look good using trial and error. I ended up using 2 sky photos, and then I adjusted the look of like the skies using the color balance, and then I duplicated the layer, Gaussian blur for dreamy effect, and then I changed the layer modes until it looked good. And then I ended up combining the 2 sky pictures using a layer mask and then a big airbrush on low opacity, and I erased like the top half of the sky photo on top to slightly reveal the clouds of the second sky photo under. I also adjusted the colors of the second sky photo to match better with the first sky photo using color balance. Here's a Procreate tip. I don't know if it'll be applicable to other art programs, but this is what I do on Procreate. I make a layer on top of whatever I want. In this case, it's the hair. And I used an airbrush on max opacity, and then I like drew out the places that I want to be more blurry. And then I used a Gaussian blur to blur that. And then with the layer selected, use any type of blur to blur the layer of choice. So this is the hair. And then when you're done, you deselect the area, and now only that portion with the mask is blurry without messing up the rest of the layer. And then I delete the masking layer because it's done its job. And then I adjusted the composition and then worked on lighting. Since the sky background is warm toned and I'm made up of like colder blues, I did an orangey yellow layer clipped to that layer, and then I messed around with layer modes and layer opacity. I ended up using the soft light blending mode, and then I make a new layer on top set to multiply, and then use the airbrush to draw a pink and purple like dynamic shadow, Gaussian blurred it and lowered the opacity. And then here's when I realized I'm missing an earring because Procreate crashed when I drew earrings the first time. So I had to redraw the earring. And I thought I needed a lighting adjustment layer using like the color blue for some reason. But none of it was looking right, so I scrapped that idea. I added a paper texture on top of everything using a multiply blending mode and adjusted the opacity. And then I organized the layers to look nicer, added a watermark, and then I felt like the piece was lacking something, so I added extra effects off recording. I basically used Procreate's light leak brush on an add blending mode layer and adjusted the layer opacity, and then I used the Procreate light pen, and then clipped on top of that I did the rainbow, and then I blurred the rainbow, and then I merged it down to the light pen layer, and then I blurred that layer, and then adjusted the opacity, and that's it. And if you've made it this far into the video, comment a star or include a star in your comment to let me know that you've watched everything, because you deserve a gold star for listening to my voice talk and explain poorly how I draw. Anyways, I'm tired and my voice is dying, so I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.
6 figures for the whip. Tell her throw it